So we'll begin recording. What? Never asked them to do that. All right. Okay, so you guys are all muted. So you unmute yourselves. I'll unmute you.
Can I just say, why did it ask me if I accept being recording, I can continue being in the class? I've never seen that before.
I don't know. I must have hit some button. I don't know.
No,
Okay. So if you have the text in front of you, we'll begin. This is Hadran, which means an analysis of the last teachings of tractate Masechta Rosh HaShono, which is a Masechta devoted, of course, to Rosh HaShono. So the first quote there in the bold at the top of the page is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says as follows. It records a dispute between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim and the sages. And that is, Kishem sheshliach tzibur chayev. So this is the sages. In the same way that the shliach tzibur, which means literally the agent of the congregation, one who leads the service, it's called the shliach tzibur. Chazan actually is a wrong term. Chazan means something else. The one who leads the service is called the shliach tzibur. It's come to be known as a chazan for reasons that we'll go into now. It's not really the correct term. So a shliach tzibur, so just like the shliach tzibur chayiv is obligated to repeat, to say the Amidah aloud, we're talking about the Amidah. The Amidah is the essence, the heart of tefillah, of prayer. Not to be confused with Shema. Shema is not a prayer. Shema is a declaration of faith, which we do, which we're commanded to declare twice a day, the Torah says, in the morning and the evening. And our sages fixed that the fulfillment of the mitzvah of reciting the Shema should be said in proximity to prayer, but they're two separate mitzvahs entirely. And the Shema is not a prayer, you're not talking to God, you're not asking for anything, it's a quotation, you're declaring your faith, and and we repeat some of the passages in Torah that we're commanded to say. The sages added to those passages. But at any rate, we often call Shema a prayer. It's not in the sense, the conventional sense of a prayer where we're talking to Hashem and addressing Him. It's a declaration to our fellow Jew, to ourselves. We're not talking about Shema. So we're talking about davening, prayer. The essence of prayer is the Amidah. Prayer, as we know it, tefillah, evolved over time and things were added to it. But the essence is the Amidah. Initially, mind you, there was no formal prayer, no formal text at all. An individual would pray as per need. But at a certain point in history, the sages saw a need for a universal formula. They said the great Sanhedrin. All this happened between really towards the end of the first Beis Hamikdash, and many enactments were made, including the formulation of davening and a host of other rituals that we observe today, which were enacted by the sages for uniformity and for many other reasons as well. Various enactments, which are part and parcel of Jewish life to this day. So that's some background. Again, so back now to the Amidah. So let's read the Mishnah again. The Mishnah says, just like the Shliach Tzibur was appointed by the community to say the Amidah aloud, so just like he has to say it, obviously, kach kol yochid v'yochid chayev. Each individual praying in that minyan, at least a minyan, is also obligated to say the Amidah. In brackets, shekol yochid matzibur chayev lispalol la'atzmai. Every individual in the congregation has to say the Amidah to himself, and then the Shliach Tzibur repeats it. So like in the same way that he has to repeat it, that's why he's a Shliach Tzibur, that's his mandate, is to say it loud for all to respond to. Similarly, everybody has to say it privately before. That's the opinion of the Tanna Kama. Tanna Kama means the first author, is unnamed. Anonymous, but it's Rabbi Yehuda. or it's the sages, it's the majority. That's the opinion of the majority. Rabbi Gamliel says, Shliach Tzibur moitzi es Rabbi Yedei that the Shliach Tzibur discharges, by repeating the Amidah aloud, he discharges the community from their obligation. And so there's no real obligation upon the individual to say the Amidah to him or herself before, because, says Rabbi Gamliel, the Shliach Tzibur, that's the whole point of it, discharges everyone of their obligation. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. We have a machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Gamliel, whether each individual is obligated to say the Amidah. The Tanakama, the first author, the Chachamim say yes. Rabbi Gamliel says there's no obligation. Now the Gemara, that was the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, Tanya. Tanya means we learned in the Braisa. What's a Braisa? A Braisa means literally outside. Namely, just some historical background to understand what a Braisa means, what Tanya means, what the word Tanya means. The book Tanya is called Tanya because it begins with this word. What Tanya means is this, that Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, Rabbi Yehuda, the great sage, the leader of his time, was one of the greatest sages of the Talmud. And what he did is he compiled the Mishnah. He was the first one to commit the oral law to writing. And he compiled the entire body of the Mishnah, collecting all in a very orderly way, making 6 orders, then dividing into tractates, into chapters, into Mishnahs. And he collected all of the discussions of his contemporaries, the Tanoim, the sages of that era and earlier, and recorded them in this very orderly fashion, discussing every aspect of Jewish law possible. He left many of the discussions of the sages outside of this body called the Mishnah, because he only included in a very seminal and very brief way their discussion. Where they had a more elaborate discussion, he didn't include in the Mishnah. And the Gemara, which is the next generation or generations of scholars that analyze the Mishnah, Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, of course, their first thing they do in discussing it in Mishnah is bring to the table all of the brises, all of those discussions amongst those sages about this subject, not included in the Mishnah. So the Gemara begins with Tanya. We learned in the Braisa more elaboration about this discussion between the Chachamim and Rabbi Gamliel. Let's read it. They said to Rabbi Gamliel, you say that what? That there's no obligation for the individual to say the Amidah because the Shliach Tzibur discharges the obligation, says it on behalf of everybody. So according to you, Lama Tzibur mispaled. And so why is everybody, the fact is everybody does say the Amidah before. So why do they have to say it before? Just come to shul and then sit there, stand there and listen and answer Amen. Done. Why is everybody saying the Amidah? Amalehem, he answered to them, what's the reason everybody says the Amidah before? It's not because they have to fulfill their obligation. They don't. They fulfill their obligation with the Shliach Tzibur. However, they say it kedei in order lahazdir Shliach Tzibur tfilas. In order to give time for the Shliach Tzibur, he's saying it by heart. This is before the invention, 1,000 years before the printing press. There were very few manuscripts of anything. So leave the prayer. So he's saying the prayer by heart. So in order that he should, review it in his mind before, so that when he says it fluently. That's why everybody says the Amidah quietly before, just to give him this opportunity. In the brackets, quoting from Rashi, the Shliach Tzibur should have time to prepare his tefillah, which he's going to say. So Rabbi Gamliel says that the only reason that the individuals in the congregation are saying the Amidah is just to give time for the Shliach Tzibur to have it arranged in his mind so that he says it fluently. He reviews it first. He's saying it by heart. The Gemara continues in the Braisa. Gamliel, how's the question for the sages? The Divreichem, you're saying everybody's obligated. So if you're saying everybody fulfills their obligation to pray when they say their personal Amidah, who needs a Shliach Tzibur? That's his question to them. I'm sure you were thinking this when you heard the Mishnah. Probably thought of both questions, right? So Gamliel said to them, the Divreichem, according to your words, he said to the Chachamim, Lama Shliach Tzibur Yodef Ne'ateva. Why do you need a Shliach Tzibur? The translation, go down before the box, the ark. Go down. It used to be no longer, but it used to be that the Shliach Tzibur, that the shul was built, that at the front of it, the floor descended. And then, in the front wall, the eastern wall, of course, is the ark. But the Shliach Tzibur's position was not elevated, the contrary, but descended. Why? In fulfillment of the verse, out of the depths I call you. Humbling. From the depths, so the front of the shul went down, not up. Now, just as an aside, in MTC, we're all used to it, but Chassidim and the whole Ashkenaz world, the Shliach Tzibur does not daven from the bima like we have it in MTC. The Shliach Tzibur goes in here the shul, you'll see virtually that the Shliach Tzibur davens in the front, on the right of the Aron HaKodesh. Now, in some shuls in Israel today, it's literally the steps down.
Old school MTC had that.
Pardon?
Old school MTC.
That's right. Old school MTC had that. We didn't in the new one, just for practical reasons. The way the shul was configured, it just didn't work. No one could hear in the back. So the Svardim do daven from the bima in the center. It's obviously permissible. So we adopted that minig as well. But I don't think you'll see that in any Chabad house or any Lubavitcher shul in the world anywhere. I doubt it. We're the only ones that did it, just for practical reasons. The way the lot is, and we had to build a shul and divide, and the decision to put the women alongside the men rather than the back. If you put the women in the back, like in many shuls, we would have a broader front, that we could have the Shliach Tzibur, right? Davening conventionally. I didn't want to have the women in the back. I wanted them alongside. So it made the shul very narrow and there wasn't room. Plus you wouldn't hear. No. So I'm just telling you a little inside story why in MTC we do it the Sephardic way, which is the daven from the bima. I'm just explaining the words of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, when Gamliel said to the Chachamim, according to you, why does the Shliach Tzibur go down before the ark? Because he's talking about that the place where the Shliach Tzibur is. Okay, that was just an aside, a little bit of history. That's his question. So his question to the sages is, you're saying that everybody has to daven and they're obligated. Who needs the Shliach Tzibur? So they answered, Omruloi. They said to him, why do you need a Shliach Tzibur? In order to discharge someone who doesn't know how to daven. If he doesn't know how to pray, again, this was in the time of the Talmud, many Jews were illiterate. There's no printing press and so on. And so people didn't know how to daven, didn't know Hebrew, and didn't know how to pray. And so that the Shliach Tzibur was there by listening to him and answering Amen, discharge their obligation. And this is a principle in Judaism, which we all experience often, that the Shliach Tzibur, Friday night, Kiddush, one person has in mind others, makes the bracha, we all answer Amen, and we discharge our obligation. Like Friday night Kiddush as an example, and many other examples. So that's why it's only for the one who can't daven. Rabbi Gamliel gets the last word, and he says, Amalem, he said back, he retorts back to the Chachamim, Keshem moitzi she'einu boki, kach moitzi saboki. He said the Shliach Tzibur discharges everybody, the one who knows, the one who doesn't know how to daven. End of discussion. We're left with a number of questions. One of them is, at least according to Gamliel, if someone knows how to daven, still, why do you need the Shliach Tzibur to discharge his obligation? He does it himself. So we're going to explore now. The Rebbe is going to explore now and peel back the layers here, and explaining this dispute. What are we left with at the end? Let's just summarize the conclusion. The conclusion is that according to the Chachamim, the Shliach Tzibur's role is only for the one who doesn't know how to daven. And everybody should daven. And according to Rabbi Gamliel, the Shliach, everybody's obligated to. The Shliach Tzibur, get back to the Chachamim again, it's only for the one who doesn't know. According to Rabbi Gamliel, the Shliach Tzibur is paramount, and he discharges everybody their obligation, both those who know and those who don't know. Okay. That's clear? We're clear? The two opinions? Yeah. Now, let's now look at the explanation, this fascinating explanation of the underpinning of these two views that leads to other subjects and fascinating history as well, which I hope to share with you. To understand the matter, davening with the tzibur, I'm going to try and use the Hebrew words. Tefillah b'tzibur means davening with the minyan. Tzibur means a congregation. Interestingly, in parenthesis, the word tzibur, the main letters are tzadik, beis, reish. You can hear it, tzibur. Tzadikim, beinanim, rishoyim. The righteous, the intermediary, the wicked. A tzibur embraces the entire community. It's a very powerful statement. It's saying that a congregation should not be selective as to who can pray with them. In fact, our sages tell us that any public prayer that doesn't include the sinners is not accepted on high. And they bring a hint from this, from the incense, the ketores, the incense that's offered. It's the most sacred offering. It's more sacred than an ordinary offering. It's brought every day on the golden altar, but Yom Kippur it's brought by the high priest, as we all know, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Said it has 11 components. One of them is foul smelling on its own, representing the sinners. And if it's missing, it's not kosher. It's a hint that for communal prayer to be accepted, everybody has to be part of it, even the sinner. So, of course, the reason is on a very simple level. Hashem desires nothing deeper than his children united. That's the biggest nachas. Not so perfect, but united. Excluding a Jew and being in judgment of him, obviously if you're excluding him as well, that's a sin on top of a sin, is very displeasing to Hashem. So remember this, a tzibur stands for tzadikim, beinanim, rishoyim. Okay, close parenthesis. Do you mind if we do little tangential things? It's good to learn. Yeah, okay, good. So back now to understanding these two views, the Chachamim and Rabbi Gamliel. Okay, so binyan tefillah b'tzibur, with respect to davening with the tzibur, in brackets, it's one of the greatest virtues of tefillah, prayer, as I just told you, to be fully the most potent, the most powerful kind of prayer is a congregational prayer, not davening on one's own. For many reasons. First of all, again, I just told you, it's a nachas to Hashem when his children come together. And also on a personal level, on a selfish level, prayer is basically petitioning God. So if you're coming on your own, you're going to be judged on your own merit. Do I deserve forgiveness? Do I deserve health? Do I deserve all the things I'm asking for? But if I come with the community, I'm asking the merit of everybody else. It's a very different request. When you daven with the tzibur, you're basically also saying, not me alone, but in the merit of my brothers and sisters. There, my fellow Jew, more virtuous than I am, as we should all sincerely believe, and it's the truth, you come together with the tzibur. So that's out of personal level, a reason to daven with the congregation. By the way, just as an aside, so there are certain times to daven. We all know the Shema has its time, and the Amidah of Shachris has its deadline, and Mincha has its time, and Ma'ariv has its time. Why? Because there are certain times when the King of Kings is disposed, is going to entertain the people, and these are times of divine favor, and you want to daven during that time with the community. And many people are really strict about this for these reasons. You daven at the proper time with the minyan. They won't daven with the minyan, it davens late, after the time. Because it's not a time of divine favor, and you want to get your prayer in at the best, with the best, what we're looking for, with the best possible hope of your prayer being answered. And that is, come with everybody together and come at the time when the king says, this is a time of divine favor. So the question is, the fact is that with the emergence of the Hasidic movement, it's not that long ago, and particularly the Hasidic masters would daven all kinds of hours after the official time is over, without going into where these times come from. It's all based on the offerings in the Beis HaMikdash. How could they do this? Most notably was the Tosher Rebbe of blessed memory. He was a great tzaddik. And he used to daven, I don't know, he could daven mincha at 4 a.m. Like there was no time, no clock. And certainly not with a minyan, because he daven for hours. So how do we understand this? One of the many answers to this is a whole separate discussion, but it's a fascinating answer. As I just told you, so these times, what do they mean? These are times where of divine favor, the king is inclined, or is disposed towards hearing requests and granting them, God willing. So you want to get your prayer in at the proper time and with the merit of the many. But why is it that the ministers can approach the king anytime? The ministers, though, there's no special time for a minister to approach the king, especially the very close ministers. Why is that? The answer is because when the ministers approach the king, they're not coming for personal requests. It's all about the welfare of the state. It's a whole different conversation. Anytime. And that is the difference. The tzaddik davens not for himself, but for Hashem. Your need, your purpose, his fellow Jew. And therefore, the tzaddik doesn't have the limitations of, you better get it in now and make sure you come in with everybody else so that you'll get a pass. You won't be under such scrutiny, time of divine favor. Okay, it's a whole different kind of prayer, a whole different davening. It's not about him and his needs. Complete devotion to the king, to Hashem, and Hashem's objective, Hashem's need, as it were, Hashem's purpose. Therefore, the tzaddik is not bound by these limitations, a whole different order of davening. Clear? It's not the only answer, but it's an interesting insight. Yeah? Okay. Let's go back. Let's start the text again. I keep on getting, we're branching out. Let's get back now to the text again. So, with respect to davening with the tzibur, which is one of the greatest virtues of davening, for the reason I just told you, the basic level, the sages hold, the chachamim hold. What's the beauty of it all? Shetzibur ikir. The fact that many come together and daven, that's its beauty. That's its virtue. What does it mean, congregational prayer? What is congregational prayer? Just that, congregational prayer. Many come together and daven as one. What about the shliach tzibur? As we learned, and the whole repetition of the amidah by the shliach tzibur, that's what it's called. Repetition of the amidah is called chazoras hashatz, Shat stands for Shliach Tzibur. Chazara review. So he's reviewing, the Shliach Tzibur is reviewing the Amidah. Why is he doing that? It's only, according to the Chachamim, Eina Ela Takana, it's only enacted Kedei Lahoitzi Shein Boki for the one that doesn't know how to daven. But the main Shliach, the Tefillah B'Tzibur is not the Shliach Tzibur's davening. It's the Tzibur davening before. Clear? That's the Chachamim. We're clear? Yeah. Mashake and Gamliel Svidalahu, where the bottom of the right hand column, 3 lines from the bottom, Gamliel holds. No. The virtue of communal prayer is embodied in the Shliach Tzibur. Shliach Tzibur Iker, the main thing, the beauty, is this one singular voice, the Shliach Tzibur. Hainu, he holds, Sheikir in Yona Shalat Tefillah B'Tzibur. What's the great virtue of the congregational prayer? Where's the main point of it all? Tefillah Hashatz. It's the Shliach Tzibur's repetition. So why are we saying it? We learned. And the reason each person, he says it himself silently, before the Shliach Tzibur says it, it's only to preparation. This is only enacted in order the Shliach Tzibur be ready, having reviewed it in his mind, doesn't just walk in and starts, but there's a time before where he reviews it. Quote, Gamliel said, the Shliach Tzibur should arrange his prayer. Okay, conclusion so far. What's the root of their argument so far? I'm going to go deeper between the Chachamim and Gamliel. The Chachamim say the congregational prayer, the Iker, the main thing is the congregational prayer. The Shliach Tzibur is only for the one that doesn't know how to. Gamliel says, no, the main thing of congregational prayer is, even for the one who knows, for everybody, it's the Shliach Tzibur representing everybody. That's the essence of it. Everybody else davens just that he should be able to get prepared. Continue. Now we're going to go deeper. We'll be at chapter 2. We'll be at a time with Svaras and Machlokes to understand the reason and the underpinning of these two views. Im Tzibur Iker is the main thing, the congregation. Shliach Tzibur Iker is the main thing, the Shatz. I'm going to call them the Shatz friends. Shliach Tzibur. Yesh Loima, the Rebbe suggests, this is all bound up in the well-known question or debate. Another word for it. Chkira means inquiry. What's the famous inquiry? The Torah is full of inquiries, the Talmud. Here's one. Ma choshev Yosef. What is more important? I like the two sides of the Riboy Akamos, great quantity, Godla Echos, or quality. Which is a greater virtue? Quantity or quality? A lot or smaller but quality? Fascinatingly, we see an argument in this very subject between the same protagonists of our Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel and his friends. Now, to understand the machlokes, I want to tell you the story behind it. It's one of the most famous stories in the entire Talmud, and I would assume that some of you may know the story. It's a long story, and I'll make it brief, but a fascinating story. The context of the story is this. This story took place 14 years after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Now, we all know what happened, the famous story. I've told this to you. I'm just going to mute you all. Okay. The Romans had all but destroyed everything. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, in another story, which I've shared with you because around Tisha B'Av, because that's when we always tell the story, from tractate Gittin, is smuggled out of Jerusalem, and he meets Vespasian, who becomes emperor. Subsequently, soon after, immediately after, that's a story in its own right. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the greatest sage of his time, one of our greatest leaders, negotiates three things. Three things. Allow Yavne, don't destroy Yavne. Yavne then became the seat of learning if scholarship, if the sages will all be destroyed and the Torah is not, we're finished. There's no more temple. We need to have, the foundation must become the school. The foundation of Jewish life thereafter must be education. The yeshiva, Yavne. And then he asked that they did not destroy the seed, the descendant of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, of this family from which Mashiach will descend, from the tribe of Yehuda, descendant of King David. And the third thing he asked for was a doctor to heal Rabbi Tzadok, who had fasted for 40 years, only eating at night, barely, seeing the impending destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Famous story, and they were granted. So Rabbon Gamliel, it's our Rabbon Gamliel we're talking about here. He was appointed, he was a descendant, the scion of Hillel the elder, was a direct descendant of King David. This is the Davidic dynasty, which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had saved. So Rabbon Gamliel was appointed Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the head of the Sanhedrin, of the Jewish court, if you like. Now there were always two heads. There was the Nasi, literally the prince or the leader, and the Av Bezdin, the head of the court. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai became the head of the court, and he appointed Rabbon Gamliel. He himself was not a descendant of. I think he was a Kohen, but he wasn't from the tribe of Yehuda. Rabbon Gamliel was the Nasi. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai died, Rabbi Yeshua replaced him. All right, so this is hearing the story here. This is after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and we're establishing the yeshiva, the role of the teachers, of the sages. And the leader is Rabbi Gamliel, and the second, the head of the court, the Av Bezdin, is Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Gamliel, you have to understand, before I tell you the story, so I'm giving you this background. In this fragile time, the Jews decimated, the carnage, the Romans put to the sword in very cruel ways, more than 1 million Jews. Relatively speaking, it was a greater tragedy than the Holocaust in terms of numbers. Percentage of Jews that were killed. Far greater. At least 1 million. Some historians say even more. And it was terrible. The situation of the Jewish people then was fragile and so on, and they were crushed. And so Rabbi Gamliel understood that we need to have unified, strong leadership. At this point, dissent and discussion is very important. It's very good, but there's got to be a unified voice. There's got to be a strong consensus, and any dissension has to be, of course, it'll be, discussion is always good, but the bottom line ruling. So you have to understand, in the context of the story, I'm going to tell you why Rabbi Gamliel was so strict. His response was so strict. So the story is, I'm not going to give all the details of it, you just get a gist of it because it's such a famous story. So the story said like this, that a student, it turns out at the end, this student turned out to be later the famous Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. We don't know his name till later. Anyway, he came before Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua, I just told you, was what? Was the Av Bezdin. And he has a question. What's his question? Did the sages enact Ma'ariv, which was just enacted not long before? Ma'ariv was one of the enactments of the sages, to daven all together. I told you that whole davening was instituted by the sages, Shachas, Mincha, Ma'ariv. So the question is, did they enact Ma'ariv as an obligation like they enacted Shachas and Mincha? Without going to the reasonings, why yes, why not? So Rabbi Yeshua said, Ma'ariv is not an obligation like Shachas and Mincha is. Then he came before Rabbi Gamliel, who's the Nasi, and he said that same question, which is a whole discussion that I ask anyway. Is it obligatory or is it just a permissible thing, elective? So Rabbi Gamliel says it's obligatory. The sages enacted it as an obligation. The student said, but Rabbi Yeshua told me, no, Rabbi Yeshua told me it's elective. So Rabbi Gamliel said to the student, wait until everybody comes to the Beis Medrash, or everybody comes, all the disciples and the sages, his colleagues, come to the yeshiva. Interestingly, the disciples are called shield bearers. That's how he called them, shield bearers. Many reasons, because learning Torah is a shield against our enemies. Another reason is the sages are arguing, so they're defending their position, they're shield bearers. Anyway, again, Rabbi Gamliel doesn't want to stamp out this dispute, but when the final ruling has to be a consensus, it's got to be uniform. For the Jewish people to go forward, it's got to be a single practice. So what happened here? Rabbi Yeshua told the student that that Ma'ariv is elective, and Rabbi Gamliel said it's obligatory. So he says, wait. So they all gathered. Rabbi Gamliel says to the student, ask a question. So he asked his question in front of all of the assembled. Is it elective or compulsory? So Rabbi Gamliel answered, the Nasi, it's compulsory. Then he turned to the sages and said, does anybody have a different opinion? Rabbi Yeshua, who had said privately, it's elective, says no. And Gamliel said, but I heard in your name that you said yes. He didn't want to contradict him in public. So Rabbi Yeshua was forced to admit that he had said yes. So what happened was, Gamliel, he's standing. Rabbi Yeshua, when Gamliel told him, stand on your feet. After he said to him, sorry, Mr. Padia, after he said to him, I heard in your name that you said yes, he said, please stand up. And the point was, he kept him standing till for that the rest of the discussion that whole day. The people were murmuring that Rabbi Gamliel is treating Rabbi Yeshua disrespectfully. And this was not the first time. Without repeating the other occasions, there were 3 other occasions where there was such a dispute, and Rabbi Gamliel, in opinion, in halacha, serious discussions about the calendar, what days in Kippur. And now this is the 3rd time, so people, the student, the disciples were unhappy. So listen to the democracy here. They were happy with Rabbi Gamliel's strong handed leadership. He makes Rabbi Yeshua stand throughout the entire discussion, the entire day's learning, and the disciples are sitting. So they decided then to remove Rabbi Gamliel from office. And then began a whole discussion who to appoint. The end was they're going to appoint Rabbi Akiva. That was the first choice, the great Rabbi Akiva. But they said, no, Rabbi Akiva doesn't have the Rabbi Gamliel, because he would be displeased at being disproved in the merits of his ancestors. I told you he came from Yehuda, from David HaMelech, and so on. This could cause harm to Rabbi Akiva, who doesn't have the pedigree. Rabbi Gamliel himself came from a very humble, Rabbi Akiva, humble beginnings, from a convert, etc. We can't appoint Rabbi Akiva, no match for Rabbi Gamliel's displeasure. These stories need to be understood deeper, but even on the surface level, you'll see at the end. At the end, they decide to appoint Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who is a Kohen. And he was the 10th generation from Ezra. But I'm telling you this story because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, when he was asked to do it, he said, I'll let you know. He went home, discussed it with his wife, and he says to his wife, but I'm too young. He was only 18 years old, and going to appoint me the head. He was a great sage. And a miracle, so she told him to take it. The miracle happened that 18 rows of white hair appeared in his beard. And friends, we make reference to this every year at the Seder. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you remember in the Seder we say there's a discussion there about mentioning the Exodus at night. He said, I'm like 70 years old. I'm like 70 years old, but I couldn't prove my position until Ben Zoma came. What do you mean? I'm like 70 years old. He's referring to this. I'm only 18, but I look like I'm 70 because the miracle that happened, heaven showed that he looked like a sage, 18 rows of white hair. The end of the story, friends, was that Rabbi Gamliel was reconciled. And Yeshua forgave him, and they were reconciled. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Gamliel shared the office 1 week. One was the leader, the other week, the other one was the leader. Why am I telling you the whole story? Because when they removed Rabbi Gamliel from office, this is what the Talmud says. It was taught in a Braisa. The day they removed, that day that Rabbi Gamliel was removed, and it stated Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that day they removed the doorkeeper of the study hall, and permission was granted to all the students to enter. Because Rabbi Gamliel, when he was Nasi, would proclaim and say, any student whose inside is not as his outside, is not sincere. In other words, his inner self is not reflective of his external. He looks like a yeshiva bacher, but inside he's not, may not enter the study hall. But the day they removed him, they removed the guard. And on that day, many benches were added to the study hall to accommodate the influx of students. Some say 400 benches were added, and some say 700 benches were added. The Gemara continues that Gamliel felt bad, or maybe I'm holding back Torah from the Jewish people, and heaven answered him. What you did was they massaged his misgivings. But what do we see from the story here? It fits in what exactly we're saying here. Just by the way, before I go further, I heard a beautiful teaching from one of the Rebbes of Ger. How did the guardian know whose inside is like his outside? Was he a prophet? He could see into the hearts of the students. How did he know? You hear the question. So the Ger Rebbe answered, you know what? He didn't let anybody. But the one that, despite the fact that was told you can't enter, found a way to get in. He was obviously the sincere one, and he was admitted. Beautiful answer. Beautiful answer. The one that, despite the rejection, found a way to come in. Oh, he's meant to be, and he was accepted. At any rate, what do we see from here? Gamliel is consistent. Gamliel is looking for quality over quantity. Gamliel, as long as he was the Nasi, had this rule in place. And as we see when he was removed, 700 benches were added. But it's consistent with his opinion here. He says when the community davens, it's not that the many, it's this one voice. And I'll soon tell you what a shliach tzibur is supposed to be. That'll be for next week. It's this one voice. That's the beauty of it. It's the quality of this one shliach tzibur who has to have unique qualities to be worthy of representing the tzibur. That's the beauty of tefillah b'tzibur. Whereas the sages, consistent with their view, no, the beauty lies in the quantity, in the many coming together. So we'll continue this discussion, God willing, next week. Already we're beginning to see, bottom line, what's the dispute? Quantity versus quality. And we can see this dispute manifested in the story of who's allowed in to the Beis HaMedrash. Okay, friends, to be continued, God willing, next week. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next week, God willing. And not we'll see before next week, God willing. But now you'll daven, and we'll have our next class, the Mordechai Dov Chernak Shir 10:15.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Everyone.
Bye.